Well, Steve, you put your finger on one of the biggest challenges. Indonesia is massive. Not only does it have a tremendous number of people who would have to be reached, perhaps over 230 million, but they're spread out over at least 13,000 different islands.
That interview is coming up later in the podcast. This is Asia News Weekly, the podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. ISIS continues to make inroads into Asia, but Indonesia has a plan that may stop recruitment. Rand Corporation's Jonah Blank joins me and weighs in on how effective the program will be. Also, Aceh has criminalized homosexual intercourse. Human Rights Watch's Phil Robertson discusses the implications. These stories and more are coming up next. Hello everyone, great to have you here on this Friday, October 30th, 2015. My name is Steve Miller and thank you so much for joining me today. Believe it or not, the end of the month is here and we have an excellent podcast ahead. So let's go ahead and kick things off with a look at how Indonesia plans on stopping its youth from joining ISIS. The world's greatest cancer is that of the Islamic State. We've seen in recent weeks how they're continuing to push into Southeast Asia, most recently with a bombing in Bangladesh that has left more than 100 people dead. We've also seen how ISIS is moving into Western countries like Australia through social media channels and recruited individuals there. However, one nation that's been especially hard hit by ISIS's recruiting efforts has been Indonesia. For more than a year, the country has grappled with the fact that scores of its young are leaving to join this terrorist group. Now, the country is preparing to implement a new plan to curb ISIS recruitment. Jakarta hopes that by using citizens that were once part of ISIS, who actually joined, left Indonesia, trained in Syria, became disenfranchised, and ultimately left ISIS, that by using these people and their stories, they can help make the case that joining ISIS is not worth it and an all-around bad idea. It made me wonder, how good of a plan is it?
I think it's a very good idea.
Jonah Blank, senior political scientist with the Rand Corporation.
It has been used quite successfully in a number of other countries, particularly if we look at the de-radicalization plans and practices in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Jordan, and in Saudi Arabia. All of these countries use former fighters, not necessarily from ISIL, but from other radical terrorist groups, to help pull their citizens back from the brink of joining groups like this.
Now, for my listeners in the United States, to put it in terms that they may be more familiar with, would you equate this to the famous Scared Straight program?
In some ways, I wouldn't oversell the parallel because Scared Straight has had mixed results. Some young potential offenders have indeed been scared straight, while others have not been nearly as scared as one might have thought. The success of the de-radicalization process by having the peers of people who might be tempted really doesn't come from trying to scare them. It comes from trying to talk to them in language that they can understand, using the type of arguments that they themselves, the at-risk individuals themselves, might have understood and might have felt and might really ring with them. It's a lot more persuasive if you're being spoken to by someone who respects you, respects what you're going through, respects your anger and your grievances, and is able to say, look, I hear where you're coming from, and I've done what you want to do, and it really didn't work out the way that I thought it would at all.
Speaking of success, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim nation, and that's an incredible amount of people to reach. What are perhaps the greatest challenges in making a program like this successful to reach as many people as possible?
Well, Steve, you put your finger on one of the biggest challenges. Indonesia is massive. Not only does it have a tremendous number of people who would have to be reached, perhaps over 230 million, but they're spread out over at least 13,000 different islands. Indonesia's infrastructure is not very good. Indonesia's media reach is not necessarily adequate for the task. And simply finding the people that you're trying to reach is a real challenge. Indonesia has tried this with Jemaah Islamiyah, a very brutal terrorist group that was centered in Indonesia and has only in the past few years really had its back broken. We don't even know if it's permanently out of business or not, and a lot of smart people are saying it hasn't been. So trying to reach a whole other set of people is very difficult. Where this has worked, or at least has been promising, has been places like Singapore, which is tiny and very well-resourced, and quite frankly, the population they're trying to reach is just much more controllable. In Indonesia, I think that it could well hold promise, but we shouldn't think that we'll see the dramatic impact that we've seen in Singapore or even Malaysia.
Well, since Indonesia is so large, and as you say, there has been some success in smaller areas, do you think it would be wise to more or less bring together all the nations that have similar programs to try and put together best practices and share the information to try and dissuade their citizens from joining ISIS or ISIL?
I think it would, not necessarily because there's one universal set of best practices. Something that works well in one country might not work in another. But I think that there are a lot of things that can work, and I think that it really would be useful for all countries that are trying to do this to sit down periodically and exchange their tales of what has worked and what has not. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time a nation tries to do this. It really would be very good if every nation could learn from the successes and learn from the failures of others who've been down this path.
Is there anything that you specifically think should be a part of a program like this?
I think one of the key elements should be tailoring it towards Indonesia itself. Every country is different, and every set of interlocutors is different. I think it would not be very useful to bring in a bunch of outsiders who are trying to say, we want to tell you, Indonesia, how to do this on your own. I think it'd be better to bring in outsiders and say, hey, here's what we have tried, and here's what has worked, here's what has not worked. I think that we should be targeting this also not in purely theological terms. A lot of the recruits of ISIS, most of the recruits of ISIS, are not very theologically adept. They're not joining because they have a deep understanding or appreciation for Islamic theology. They're joining because they have a set of grievances, and they have this vague idea that ISIS is going to let them address these grievances. So I think we really need peer-to-peer counseling. Young Indonesians or Malays, because at least the citizens of Malaysia and citizens of Indonesia in many cases are able to speak a similar enough language and have a similar life experience to be able to say that to them, look, I was sitting where you were sitting, and everything that's making you angry was making me angry, and I did what you're thinking of doing, and here's what happened. And here's what I saw, and it's not the brilliant vision that you have in your head.
All right, Jonah Blank, Senior Political Scientist with the RAND Corporation, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Steve, and have a great day.
I really hope this program takes off, and more importantly, makes a huge difference. I'd also like to see these materials shared with the world. Perhaps, as we mentioned, that by sharing these resources, we can get additional programs up and running and curb ISIS recruitment. I mean, with Australia, the United Kingdom, and even South Korea reporting teens leaving their countries to join ISIS, the stories could be helpful there as well. And coming up later in the podcast, a look at LGBTQ rights across Asia. The United States made good on its promise to challenge Beijing's sovereignty claims in the South China Sea by sailing the USS Lawson, one of its destroyers, inside the 12 nautical mile bubble surrounding newly constructed islands. The Lawson sailed close to the Subi and Mischief reefs in the hotly contested Spratly Island group, and it was immediately challenged by Chinese vessels who shadowed the American ship, informing it had illegally entered its territorial waters. What's unclear from the reports is how far the USS Lawson went past the 12 nautical mile barrier, but as we learned from Mark Kozat, Senior Defense Policy Analyst at the RAND Corporation in a recent Asia Now podcast, it isn't so much how deep the vessel penetrates, but rather the overall statement made.
I think as a general principle, if the movement through China's claimed 12 nautical mile zone is one that's shallow and very quick, that probably will send a very bad signal to others in the region and may give China some way of using that situation to show that they have the upper hand. I think it has to be something that is a very clear statement about U.S. views of freedom of navigation within that 12 nautical miles. And it has to be very clear and not on the outside of whatever that 12 nautical mile zone may be, and not for a short period of time, but something that is a very clear statement that the U.S. is asserting its right to navigate freely in those waters.
Philippine President Benigno Aquino said he welcomed the U.S. patrol, calling it a balance of power. Freedom of navigation has been expounded and propounded by all parties to the issue of the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, he said, before adding, quote, "Everybody seems to be guaranteeing freedom of navigation, so I see no issue as to this U.S. naval ship traversing under international law in waters that should be free to be traveled upon by any non-belligerent country," end quote. Beijing, well, didn't quite see it that way and summoned the U.S. ambassador over the incident. China's foreign ministry said, quote, "China will resolutely respond to any country's deliberate provocations. We will continue to closely monitor the relevant sea and airspace and take all necessary steps in accordance with the need." China strongly urges the U.S. side to conscientiously handle China's serious representations, immediately correct its mistake, and not take any dangerous or provocative acts that threatens China's sovereignty and security interests, end quote. China claimed the U.S. patrol was a coercive action that seeks to militarize the South China Sea region and was an abuse of freedom of navigation under international law. The United States said in its briefing that this wasn't a one-off incident and that more patrols in the region would follow in the next few weeks around island features Vietnam and the Philippines have constructed in the Spratlys as well. As Kozad said in that Asia Now interview, he doesn't expect China to respond irrationally or for the incident to get out of hand between Washington and Beijing. But should a third party enter the mix, then, well, that could change the situation rapidly. Expect tension and rhetoric in the region to rise as this game of chess between the two superpowers gets underway. And later in the podcast, a look at the East Asia Trilateral Summit in Seoul. Located on the northern tip of Sumatra, Indonesia, is Aceh. It's the part of the country where it's believed that Islam made its way into the nation and flourished. There are about 10 indigenous groups that account for up to 90% of the population, which brings me to the next story. Last year, leaders passed a law making it illegal for homosexuals to have sex. Now, the law not only applied to permanent residents, but tourists visiting the area. If convicted of this so-called crime, one would then receive 100 lashes with a cane. The law also bans adultery, which carries the same punishment, and it should be noted that if someone accuses another without sufficient proof, they'll receive 80 whips of the cane as well. So there is a deterrent built in from bringing forward false accusations. The law, according to Provincial Sharia Chief Shirazal Abbas in an interview with the AFP, is to safeguard human dignity, to protect Aceh's Muslims from committing immoral acts. But what about their human rights?
Well, we consider caning to be a form of torture.
That's Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division.
And torture is outlawed by international law all around the world for any reason, for any purpose. They're couching this in religion, but what they're saying is that their Islamic faith justifies torture, and that's absolutely unacceptable. The second issue, of course, is discrimination. And by discriminating against LGBT people with these kind of laws, you are setting up a situation where you're dividing society, you're marginalizing a particular social minority, these people who have decided to express their sexual orientation and gender identity in a certain way, and then justifying legally sanctioned torture, which is absolutely illegal. It's frankly outrageous, and I think that Aceh needs to be reined in by the government in Jakarta, by the federal government, basically saying that this sort of law cannot be permitted in modern day Indonesia.
Now, if we take a look at Indonesia in general, this law, as you mentioned, only affects Aceh. How does LGBTQ rights stack up overall in Indonesia?
Well, when we look at LGBT rights and what's being done against LGBT, not only in Indonesia, but also in the region, you have to look at three main things. And first of all, it's discrimination. Second of all, it's criminalization. And third, it's violence. Of those three elements, discrimination and violence apply to LGBT persons in other parts of Indonesia. What we've seen is repeated attacks against transgender rallies or organizations, particularly by highly intolerant organizations like the Islamic Defenders Front, which has perpetrated some of these attacks simply because they say that they cannot stand to have LGBT people in Indonesia. We've also seen situations where, social stigma and discrimination is quite widespread against LGBT people in Indonesia. So it makes it hard for them to find and hold a job, to have equal access to education, all those things that are important for a person's development and growth. It's very interesting that the Pew Research folks did a survey around the region about attitudes towards LGBT people, and that in Indonesia it was one of the highest findings for a lack of acceptance for LGBT people. 93% of those surveyed by Pew said that they could not accept LGBT people in society, and that's a pretty astounding figure.
What about the rest of Asia? How are things looking?
Well, we're continuing to see major problems along those areas of discrimination, violence, and criminalization. In Malaysia, there's a very serious problem. The government has, of course, made it a priority to go after LGBT activists. A woman, Nisha Ayab, who Human Rights Watch awarded our annual Alessandre Forge Human Rights Prize, was attacked by two people about 3 weeks ago, hit with metal bars as she was leaving her house in the morning to go to work. No one has been found responsible for that. There's been very little progress in investigation. In places like the Philippines, there's still violence against transgenders. In Thailand, we continue to have a problem particularly in rural areas where LGBT persons are sometimes attacked. There's been discrimination and in some cases attacks that have led to death. And these things have been sort of hushed up. The few things where we see some progress are places like Vietnam, where they said that they're going to stop criminalizing same-sex marriage ceremonies. Now, that means the actual ceremony can take place, but there's no legal recognition in law. So, it's a very, very few tiny baby steps for improvements in just a few countries, but overall a very dark picture of, again, discrimination violence and, in some cases, criminalization.
All right. Phil Robertson, Deputy Director with Human Rights Watch in Asia. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Now, I truly wish that we as a collective society would be able to put something like this behind us and simply treat everyone as equals. There's no need to deprive someone of basic rights just because they're different from you. Now, coming up next in the Friday edition of the Asia Brief, we're going to feature some stories that really make you scratch your head, plus stories about China's crackdown on civil rights lawyers and more. This weekend, Chinese President Xi Jinping, South Korean President Park Geun-hye, and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe are scheduled to meet for the first trilateral meeting between the three heads of state in Seoul. Now, there has been substantial press around this meeting, but honestly, let's not get too carried away with expecting too much. First, keep in mind that the meeting is taking place only on November 1st. Now, while Xi will be in Seoul over the entire weekend, it's expected that Abe is going to fly in on the 1st and then out on the 2nd, meaning that we're really only looking at possibly less than a full day for the three leaders to sit down and meet. When one factors in the time for the actual meet and greet, the photo sessions, and of course press conferences, the time behind closed doors is going to be kept to a minimum. Plus, don't forget that the ministers from all three nations have maintained working relationships and mostly have held regular meetings with one another over the past few years. So if anything of substance does manage to materialize from this trilateral meeting, it will be the fruit of those efforts rather than the efforts of the three leaders in Seoul. Now, Abe plans on bugging out of Seoul on the 2nd of November, shortly after meeting President Park Geun-hye. Now, already, the bar for that bilateral meeting is set extremely low. Officials are even saying that about the only thing you can really expect from the Park-Abe summit is that they actually met. However, the circumstances under how this meeting actually came through to fruition is going to be the big takeaway, since Korea has been looking for a personal apology from Abe, and he says he's not going to give one. Sure, Abe has expressed regret, even remorse, in his past addresses. And this past August, when dealing with North Korea, President Park Geun-hye equated regret with an apology. So the big question here is whether or not President Park is going to do the same with Abe. So following the meet, keep an eye on what Park has to say and see if there are renewed calls for an apology from Abe and Japan. It wasn't too long ago I remember sitting at my computer when all of a sudden my Twitter stream burst forward with a flurry of activity. The big news of the day was that while traveling by speedboat on September 28th of this year, that vessel carrying Maldives President Abdullah Yameen suffered an explosion. While the president wasn't harmed in what many thought was an accident, a mechanical failure initially, it seems, well, now we know that more was at play. Maldives police have now arrested Vice President Ahmed Adib on suspicion that he is linked to what is now being called an assassination attempt against President Yameen. Home Minister Umar Nasir posted on his Twitter account that Adib had been charged with high treason and is being held at the Dunedoo Detention Center. The Maldives is currently in the throes of a power struggle in the upper echelons of government, following the arrest and trial of former President Mohamed Nasheed. A court sentenced him to 13 years in prison for ordering the arrest of an allegedly corrupt judge while he was president a few years ago. The United Nations has ruled that trial illegal and ordered Nasheed's release. President Yameen elected not to follow that course of advice, and it remains unclear if this attempt was related. But it does make one wonder how bad things must be in the Maldives to prompt the vice president to launch an assassination attempt. Furthermore, it stands to reason that the VP wasn't acting alone because, well, he's just not going to go down there and saunter up to the boat and plant the explosive himself. Expect an immense look into the plot and that more heads will roll. Since the coup last year, the Thai junta has been more strict in its enforcement of the nation's lèse-majesté or royal defamation law. In fact, a police major had been jailed last week as part of a high-profile probe, but now the case is going nowhere as he hanged himself while in custody. The court had jailed Police Major Pakram Warmprad, along with 2 other people, a fortune teller and his assistant, guess he should have seen that one coming, as part of a probe into those falsely claiming ties to the monarchy for personal benefit. It would appear that the suspect hung himself. The jailed person was found dead in his cell and authorities tried to revive him. Right now, we are doing the autopsy. Whatever the result, we will have to accept it because this is a high-profile case of huge public interest, authorities said. Thailand has the world's harshest lèse-majesté laws and has been coming under increasing fire for that fact. In fact, many say that it stifles free speech and allows the junta and royal elite to silence opposing views and maintain control. This past week, the U.S. State Department said it was concerned over mass detentions and crackdowns against human rights lawyers and advocates that began earlier this year in China. Speaking with The Voice of America, Tom Malinowski, Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, said he raised U.S. concerns in Beijing during the 7th U.S.-China Legal Experts Dialogue. I did not see any progress on this front, meaning the treatment of rights lawyers. I think it's still good. We are able to have in-depth conversations with the Chinese government, he said. Now, one of the high-profile cases that was raised by the United States was the continuing imprisonment of Wang Yu, a 44-year-old lawyer who took on cases including that of Ilham Tohti, the prominent Uyghur scholar who was sentenced to life in prison earlier this year. Wang Yu and her husband, Bao Longwin, are among the first of hundreds that have been taken away in a sweeping crackdown against rights lawyers that began this summer. And just recently, her son, who was attempting to flee China and get to the United States, went missing, in what some say is an attempt to put extra pressure on that pair. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs responded, asking the United States to view China's progress objectively and with full respect to China's judicial sovereignty, noting it followed the rule of law and had implemented a number of judicial reforms. Malinowski said he saw a very big contradiction between the very strong emphasis on the rule of law that Chinese President Xi Jinping projected towards his people and to the world since the Fourth Plenum in particular, and this attack on legal professionals. In fact, while in the United Kingdom last week, President Xi said only that there was some room for improvement on the issue of human rights in China, but didn't bring up the issue of detentions at all, while trying to bolster economic ties with London. Last Friday, the Hong Kong-based China Human Rights Lawyers Concern Group released an update on the roughly 300 people detained since the summer crackdowns began that included lawyers, law firm staff, human rights advocates, and members of their families that have been swept up in an ever-widening net. The group said that most of the lawyers have been released, but more than 30 were still being held under some form of detention and that their whereabouts were unknown. According to the Lawyers Network Group, most were being held under residential surveillance at designated locations. Only one of the individuals targeted has been able to see a lawyer, while most families have yet to receive official notification about why their loved ones are being held. China says it's handling the cases pursuant to relevant laws, but those critical point out that China's actions, refusing to notify family members of the charges they face, where they are being held, or give the detained access to lawyers, as well as the persecution of family members, including children, are all violations of China's own laws. We're seeing it getting worse from a different aspect. It's not so much the statistical one, but rather the kind of retaliation that the government has extended to family members, says Kit Chan, a spokesman for the Human Rights Network Group. Sadly, that does seem to be the case under Xi's leadership, with many noting that they were severely disappointed to see Britain take a soft position on China's human rights issues in favor of trade deals. Sometimes you really have to wonder what's going through people's heads. I mean, things happen in today's world that really just makes me want to go, what the f***? And this week was no different. First up in South Korea, the nation's Supreme Court will review a case of a man found not guilty of raping a middle school girl. According to Yonhap News, the Seoul High Court found the defendant not guilty, even though the girl was 15 at the time of the crime and he was 27 years older. The girl reported the crime to the police and the man was subsequently arrested. Court documents show he even got the girl pregnant. However, the rationale for the acquittal is what's infuriating. In a previous run at Korea's Supreme Court, the perpetrator insisted he loved the child he raped, and the court bought it, sending the matter back to the lower court. And that seemed enough to help get the individual a not guilty verdict. So now prosecutors are left with a daunting task to try and take this matter once more up the food chain, with little hope for a different outcome. As of late, the courts in South Korea have been making some sound decisions, but every once in a while they do something that really makes you question their thought processes. The last such moment was last year when a court acquitted a man of rape because his penis was curved. It really makes you wonder when the country will grow out of this phase and truly respect women and victims of sexual crimes. In this nation that dresses up young girls as sexual objects for the purpose of perpetuating the Korean wave of K-pop, there still is a tendency to victim blame, and that practice needs to stop now. But South Korea wasn't the only country this week that made several people cry out that four-letter word expletive. Oh no, the winner this week was China. According to an article in the Shanghaiist, they seem to have the world's worst teacher. Why? Well, try this one on for size. As the story goes, a female kindergarten teacher in Henan said that she was trying to give boys in the class a sexual education lesson to help them learn about the meaning of life. So she excused the girls in the class and had the 20 or so boys stripped down to their birthday suits. Then she positioned them into various poses like giant hearts and whatnot to snap their picture, and then posted them to her WeChat timeline. She justified her decision to upload those images by saying that she thought the kids were cute. Parents were, as one might expect, shocked and horrified to see the images of their children naked online. Outrage ensued, not only from the parents, but from other netizens. Now, while the school and the teacher have apologized, it appears she still has her job. Seriously, both the teacher and the institution need to go. This action in no way is acceptable under any circumstance. In both of these cases, I can't help but to think that if these were my children being affected by the decisions and the actions, what would I do? How would I respond? And the only answer I can come up with is complete rage. Seriously, what kind of sick world do we live in where we have things like this happen without any apparent backlash? Don't forget you can catch the Asia Brief Monday through Thursday mornings on our website or in your favorite podcast application. That's it for the news, but before I wrap things up, here are a few of your comments from the week. First up, Joe Park had this to say on a story about rote memorization in China and how it might be crippling children's creativity and the economy down the road. Sometimes rote memory is good. Often creativity is just another way of saying lack of discipline and effort. And you know what? He is right. But the converse is also true. As someone who teaches in a system where rote memorization is the norm, when information is presented that requires application rather than regurgitation, the students often struggle, which is a sign they haven't really been able to assimilate and apply the knowledge. Scott Stealth on the South China Sea had this to say: China has plans to build hundreds of air bases all over the West Philippine Sea and even 10 kilometers off the Philippines coastlines, and Malaysia as well. Then they will move into the Pacific to claim territory that belongs to China since ancient days. There will be thousands of Chinese bases all over the world on shallow reefs in 60 years. Red White Dude added this: the United States should send its ships in more often. That should make a mockery about China's claim and send a clear message. And why does the Korean side keep bungling their demands on the comfort women issue? It makes it look like it's just political showboating to the domestic audience. Not that it isn't, but it seems it is purely for that. Hey, I'd like to extend my thanks to everyone who took the time to send in their comments this week. I truly do appreciate it. But this portion of the podcast, this segment only works with you. So if you have a thought or opinion about any one of the stories in this episode, please send them in or record yourself on your phone and mail in that audio file. Don't forget, tomorrow's Asia Now podcast is dropping on Saturday morning, and in it, you'll hear author Robert Neff recount the tale of Emily Brown. She is Korea's second empress, who happens to be an American. Hey, my friends, if you enjoyed this week's podcast, I hope you'll do me a favor and share it with your friends. And if you haven't, subscribe. Subscribing is free and easy to do. Just go to our website, asiannewsweekly.net, and click on the subscribe tab. You can also subscribe in your favorite podcast application like iTunes or Stitcher. Now, if you want to keep up with more news from the region, be sure to follow Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And of course, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. The email address to write to is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. My name is Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you so much for listening this week. So until next time, be true to yourself and always be awesome.